Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are dissecting a phenomenon that is quite literally rewriting the rules of global economics. This isn't just another story about a really rich guy. We're taking a hard look at an unprecedented financial reality that's changing the very definition of wealth. Let's just dive right in and look at the puzzle we're trying to solve today.
All right, I want you to imagine something wild for a second. Picture a newly emerged sovereign state on the world map. But it doesn't have borders, there's no capital city, no standing army, and absolutely no flag waving in the wind. Yet its economic power and sheer financial weight is bigger than dozens of actual recognized nations put together. Sounds totally impossible, right? You might be racking your brain right now thinking of some massive corporate conglomerate, but the answer isn't a nation or a traditional corporation at all.
The answer is a single person, Elon Musk. His wealth has reached a level where simply calling him a billionaire or even a multi-billionaire kind of completely misses the point. His true power isn't sitting quietly in a traditional bank account. It is actively woven into the future he's trying to build for humanity. His financial footprint is basically an empire without borders. We're talking about a single economic force that completely eclipses the budgets of numerous countries combined.
So to truly grasp the scale of this borderless empire, we're moving into Section 1, the new definition of wealth. Think about how global power has evolved over time. Back in the day, if you owned a gold mine, you essentially ruled the world. Then, that power naturally shifted over to the oil tycoons. They were the ones making the decisions that shaped the globe. Fast forward a bit, and massive banks and financial institutions basically took the wheel. But today, in the 21st century, the definition of wealth has evolved once again. True power is no longer dug out of the ground. It orbits in space through satellites. It lives in the data of billions of people, in AI algorithms, and the digital infrastructure of tomorrow.
So how does a trillion-dollar fortune actually work in practice? Well, first off, it is definitely not a giant vault of cash. A massive chunk of Musk's wealth is locked up in the astronomical valuations of companies like Tesla, SpaceX, and his AI ventures. And because it's tied to these volatile markets, his net worth can literally swing by tens of billions of dollars in a single day. But the absolutely crucial point here is the scale. At this magnitude, you aren't just a businessman anymore. You become a macroeconomic force. We're talking about a fortune that easily dwarfs the annual GDP of many sovereign nations. At this level, one person's decisions heavily impact governments, global markets, and entire industries.
Now, this is where things get a bit weird, pivoting from a financial reality into an outright economic mystery. Let's dive into Section 2, the $9 billion paradox. $9 billion. That is the projected financial loss for SpaceX across the years 2025 and 2026. I mean, in the normal business world, bleeding that much money would cause absolute mass panic, right? Investors would be running for the hills immediately.
But SpaceX somehow completely defies financial gravity. For a traditional company, you're valued strictly on today's profits. But with SpaceX, the world is reacting in the exact opposite way. It's almost like the bigger the losses get, the more investors are absolutely begging to buy in. Why? Because they aren't looking at today's balance sheet. They are valuing the company based on where it might take human civilization over the next 50 years. Investors aren't buying rockets here. They're buying a concept, a vision of a future where humanity is no longer stuck solely on Earth.
To make sense of this crazy paradox, we have to totally flip our perspective on what this company actually does. And that brings us to Section 3, building the space railway. Here's the real game changer. SpaceX is not a rocket company. I know, that sounds crazy to say, but the rockets, they are literally just the tools. What they actually are is an interplanetary infrastructure builder. They are trying to build the foundational architecture needed for a permanent highway system between Earth and space. And you know, we've actually seen this happen before in history. Think back to the 19th century. Railway lines completely transformed the world, connecting distant cities and vast continents, and kicking off a massive industrial boom. Well, SpaceX is basically trying to pull off the exact same feat for the 21st century, just on a cosmic scale. Their vision is to literally connect Earth, the Moon, and eventually Mars. And that is exactly why the company is fiercely plowing the vast majority of its potential profits right back into reinvestment. They aren't hoarding cash, they're busy laying the tracks. And a huge part of laying those tracks involves Starlink. A lot of people mistakenly think Starlink is just, a neat internet service for rural areas. But the reality is far, far more intense.
We're talking about tens of thousands of satellites forming a global communications web unlike anything in human history. If they pull this off entirely, a single company will have access to every continent, every deep ocean, and every remote jungle on the planet. That means comprehensive control and influence over future data transmission, global communications, AI networks, and even military defense links. The sheer economic power of that is almost unfathomable.
Of course, with that kind of unfathomable power comes some truly unprecedented risk, which leads us to Section 4, the ultimate financial gamble. So what exactly is this sci-fi future that investors are throwing billions at? Well, get this. They are looking at space-based data centers running on constant solar energy to solve the massive AI power and cooling crisis down here on Earth. They're betting on lunar economies, massive industrial centers in orbit, full-on Mars colonies, and even mining asteroids for rare minerals. I mean, it sounds exactly like a crazy movie script, right? But this is the actual, highly funded business plan driving their valuation.
But yeah, there's a pretty massive catch here. Most of this technology, it just straight up doesn't exist yet. Even SpaceX openly admits that their grandest plans rely on tech that hasn't even been invented or perfected. Investors are literally pouring fortunes into a world that hasn't been built. It's the equivalent of buying prime real estate on planets where we can currently barely land a robot.
And this really highlights a super fascinating reality about modern markets. A traditional financial spreadsheet, looking at current revenue versus current expenses, makes SpaceX look like an absolutely wild risk. But what's actually happening here is psychological valuation. Millions of people look at Musk not just as a CEO, but as the architect of the future. When he talks about a Martian economy, people don't just laugh it off, they actually believe it. This astronomical valuation is built entirely on his vision, and the shared global narrative that humanity's next chapter in space is inevitable.
Which really brings us to a pretty intense conclusion from financial analysts who are watching all this unfold. They put it like this: SpaceX is the modern era's biggest speculation, a gamble unlike any in history. And honestly, that is for sure not an exaggeration. We have literally never seen a financial bet of this magnitude placed on an outcome that is so incredibly far in the future and so packed with technological hurdles. If it works, today's wild valuations will actually look like a total steal. But if these massive plans fail, it could trigger the bursting of one of the largest financial bubbles in human history.
So that leaves us with one massive, lingering question to wrap up on. Are we watching the very foundation of the next great industrial revolution? Are we really gonna see permanent human economies built on the moon and Mars? Or is this whole thing just the most incredibly expensive trillion-dollar mirage ever created? Well, only the coming decades will give us the real answer. But one thing is absolutely